I'm going live again just because I am trying this out once again, but I had a thought about critical thinking just because somebody asked me a question today. What time is it now in the UK? It's 5:45 p.m. Just came home. Well, I'm not home, but just came back from work, went to go see a client, and a question came up, which I thought was great to kind of jump onto live and discuss. And obviously at the same time, I am really trying out Substack and its live features. So I'm gonna call this another dummy one. So question I had today. The question was, what is critical thinking? Now, let me caveat that by saying, of course, I talk about what is critical thinking all the time, but the context in which this happened was I was going to see a client and we were discussing, this is for the people consultant side, we were discussing decisions. And I mentioned critical thinking. I said I made a decision because I thought critically about something. And this employee, which is an employee of a client of mine, said, okay, so what is critical thinking and what isn't critical thinking? So that got me thinking. We do discuss what critical thinking is, and we never really talk about what critical thinking isn't. So in order to understand fully what critical thinking is, we need to know what critical thinking isn't. So that's a really good conversation, and I'll perhaps mention kind of the key points today and maybe elaborate on an upcoming deep think essay on Substack. So critical thinking, I hate kind of saying it sometimes because I think it's such a buzzword today, but it's a very, very, very important skill to have. What critical thinking is, let's start there, is I call it thinking expansively. So if we take the word expansive, it means expanded. It means going past. It means outside of the boundaries, outside of the realms of your thinking or your conditioning, for example. It means looking for connections and associations with a topic, with an idea, with a decision. So let's say like you're making a personal decision. You want to move homes or move jobs. Let's say, you run a business or, you've got a new idea to, I don't know, release a different kind of service, something that you've never done before. Whatever decision it may be, if we think about the decision itself, we know kind of where we want to reach, where we want to end up. You're going to make a decision. Do you need to move? Do you need to look for another job? Do you like this job? And that's what we call linear thinking, because it's very kind of straight line thinking. Most of us think this way. Expansive thinking is looking at connections and associations. So let's take the example of, do I want to change jobs? I was offered a job. Do I want to move? What are the pros and cons? Linear thinking. If I'm looking for connections and associations, so things, elements or factors linked to this new job, then what I'm doing is thinking critically, because I'm breaking this concept, this decision, this idea down in different components. I'm looking at things that are not directly relevant to the moving of jobs or place, etc., but other things. So I might take location, for example. Maybe the new job is only a stone throw away from your last job, but you want to think critically about the component of location. When I say location, what's the next word that pops into your mind? For me, everyone's different. For me, what pops into my mind is leisurely activities. So then I might start looking at, right, what are the things that I can do around that local area of this new job? Are there leisure centres? Is there a shopping centre? Is there a kind of a business centre? Are there local shops and businesses? Is there a coffee shop? That's not something that you would have thought of if you were only thinking about, should I take the job? Yes or no? Again, linear thinking. So critical thinking, to me, that was a very basic example, is expansive thinking. Again, just to remind you, looking at connections, things that are associated with that thing. And I like to do it, in the way that I've just described, when you break things down into different components and think of the first word that you think of when you mention one of those components. So then you can go even further. Let's say, location, I thought of leisurely activities, right? If I say leisurely activities, thinking from the top of my mind, this is live, not scripted. I haven't planned this at all. I love speaking my mind, so this is what I'm doing. When I say leisurely activities, the next thing that pops into my mind is family. That's for me anyway. So then I might look at, actually, are there a lot of families in the area? And instantly I start thinking about, right, what are the demographics in the area? If I'm going to be spending a lot of my time in this new workplace, I better think about the type of people that make up that local economy, for example. And then thinking more expansively, going further and further. When I think family, I start thinking about, schools. Is it a possibility that one day I might move here? Am I thinking too straightforward? Is there a possibility? Is there an opportunity to do something completely different with my life here? So again, those connections and associations are what helps somebody think critically. And although I talk about very many processes and rules and tools to help you think critically, one of the most powerful things you can do, and it gets better over time, is when you can think of those associations instantly. And you can do that once you've practiced critical thinking over a period of time. Critical thinking is just like any other skill, it gets stronger. It's like a muscle, gets stronger the more you build, the more you practice it. So that's one of the things that I would say is the most foolproof way to think expansively, i.e. critically. Now, that's what critical thinking is. Now, let's go back to what I said initially. When I was faced with an employee of my client who said to me, right, Tina, what is critical thinking in the way that I'm saying it? And what isn't critical thinking? So critical thinking isn't having to agree with other people. That's a massive misconception. I have faced very many conversations with people that say, right, if I'm thinking critically and somebody else is bringing an idea or a decision to the table, do I then have to, because I'm a critical thinker, agree with their concept or agree with their takeaway? The answer is no. I'd think I'm a very nice person, but I'm not always. I don't always agree with people because they've said, they have a different idea to me. But a critical thinker in that situation, what they do is not only look for the flaws in the other person's thinking, but look for the flaws in their own thinking. So let's say I'm in disagreement, going back to the idea of moving jobs. Let's say I'm speaking to my spouse. I think it's a good idea to move jobs and he doesn't, right? It's not to say I have to agree with him because he said so. It's more breaking his thinking down in different components. Looking for the kind of flaws in his thinking. Is the other person presenting to you an idea or their decision or their point of view with no reasoning, right? Is this just a statement or a statement of fact with no reasoning whatsoever? Because if that's the case, then actually we can safely say that's flawed thinking. It's not thinking critically. Therefore, I don't have to conform with other people's ideas of, or other people's ideas or decisions. Critical thinking is also not, not being, a lot of people think when you're a critical thinker, you have to kind of be unsure about yourself and your thinking because you're a critical thinker, you're challenging yourself. That's not what critical thinking is. You don't have to second guess yourself and your reasons. You just have to be confident enough that you've reasoned, that your reasoning is fair, that your reasoning is, it looks at different components of your thinking, that you're looking at different avenues and different possibilities, that you're looking at alternatives. So critical thinking isn't challenging yourself for the sake of trying to prove your own self wrong, right? That's not what it is. And the third thing, another massive misconception is a lot of people think critical thinking is thinking negatively. When we say pros and cons, which is linear thinking, people assume that when you're thinking critically about something, you're almost having to look at the downfalls, the detrimental side, the negative impacts, and it all becomes this huge negative concept. Again, misconception. Critical thinking is not being negative and disagreeing with everything. All you're doing when you're thinking critically is trying to reason and look at the different avenues and then making a decision based on all of those, right? You've looked at all avenues to your ability. We also believe in bounded rationality. There are some constraints and limitations that you have to accept. But once you've done that, saying, right, I've made an informed and calculated decision and this is what I now think, having looked at all avenues that I possibly can. And that's what's really important. And also, you might have noticed I said, looking at everything, you think you can make a calculated decision. That's the other thing critical thinking is not. It's not going to always give you the right decision. I never claim that I'm going to help people make the right decision. Ultimately, we're all in charge of our decisions and only you can decide. But what critical thinking does is it opens doors to thinking without the box, thinking for just that much outside, thinking with a different perspective, with a different person's point of view, in order to give you the best visibility for then, for you to go make that decision that you believe is the right decision. So I think that's really important to kind of address, because, critical thinking is, we don't claim that we know all the answers. Again, bounded rationality. We don't claim that we will give you everything in terms of all the knowledge. You're never going to have all the knowledge with anything. It's just being fair to yourself and your knowledge and the things that you were able to dig out. Also, I want to give you a bit of a metaphor before I leave you for this evening's thoughts. I like to relate decision-making in critical thinking to doctors and, diagnoses. Anyone that's ever gone to the doctors for anything, GPs, general practitioners is what we call them, right? Sometimes specialists, consultants. Oftentimes, particularly with GPs, when you go and ring your GP, you go into the surgery and you say, look, doctor, I've got this problem. I've got a headache. I've got, a rash, and you give a series of symptoms. Oftentimes, when you're sitting in front of the doctor in the doctor's room, they do kind of blood pressure, everything, and they don't conduct tests there and there. They don't conduct an MRI there and there. You have to go off somewhere. But mostly, and this is a lot of people's arguments in the UK, I don't know about everywhere else in the world, it stops there. You mention a series of symptoms to your doctors and they conclude based on what you said that this is the diagnosis. This is what's wrong with you. Here's a prescription for antibiotics and then you get better. And you're left wondering, thinking, right, the doctor didn't run any tests. He doesn't really, or she doesn't really know, but they've concluded this is what's wrong with me and this is the medication or treatment that I need. And that's like, much, I'd say, obviously in a different kind of area, but that's similar to critical thinking in the way that we look for different avenues, we look for different components and different elements of a decision, and then make the best decision based on what we know. Like I said, you're not ever going to know all of the answers. That's never going to happen. You just make a calculated decision or a judgment or come up with an idea based on everything that you have. Your job as a critical thinker is to make sure that you can dig up enough information and data, facts, whatever it may be, in order to make that informed decision. Anyway, that's what critical thinking isn't. But of course, I love talking about this topic. I can go on and on. If you've got any questions, you will know where to find me. Thanks so much for watching my live.